Okay. So we're replacing this rack on this 2009?
Yeah.
2009 Santa Fe. This is the old steering rack. And we had a leak right here. There's a seal underneath this collar that kept leaking on the customer on his driveway. So we're putting this, this rebuilt rack in it. So I'll just talk to you a little bit about the steering rack and how it works. So this shaft here is our input shaft from the steering wheel. You can see how it's got splines on it. Okay, so the steering shaft, which I'll show you, fastens down over this input shaft of the steering rack, and then we put a pinch bolt through here and clamp it down on top of there. So when you rotate the wheel left and right, you can see here that there's two holes where the fluid lines fasten to inside the collar of the steering rack. One of these lines is the pressure line coming from the pump, and the other line is the return line going back to the pump. So when you turn the wheel to the left, for example, inside here is a mechanism, a directional valve or a rotary control valve, whatever you want to call it, that directs the fluid, the pressurized fluid, to either one of these fluid lines, these transfer tubes. And if we follow these transfer tubes, they go along the length of the rack, and one line or one tube goes to here, bolts to here, and the other line bolts to here. So inside the tube of the rack here, and the reason we call it a rack and pinion is because inside we have two gears. This is the pinion gear, and the pinion gear converts the rotational motion of the steering wheel, and then going this way back and forth is the rack gear, and it converts the rotational motion to the back and forth of the steering wheels, of your wheels, excuse me. So inside the tube of the rack is a piston, a sealed piston inside this tube. And when we turn the wheel to the left, for example, that pressurized fluid gets transferred through this tube back into the rack, and it pushes the piston under the pressurized fluid. It pushes the piston, which is integral to the gear, and it pushes everything that way, which in turn turns the wheels to the left. When we turn the wheels to the right, the pressurized fluid gets transferred through this tube, and it pushes through pressure, fluid pressure, this piston, which turns the wheels to the right. And then whatever fluid is on the other side of the piston returns and goes back to the steering pump through the return line. So at the ends of the rack, we have this inner tie rod, which is fastened. It's screwed to the end of the steering rack. You can see the gear. You can see the gear right here. So this gear travels the length of the shaft, probably to somewhere this area here. So that way we can rotate the wheel all the way to the left and then rotate the wheel all the way to the right. So at the end of the rack is an inner tie rod, which is threaded, screwed onto the rack right here. This is the inner, and you can see how it's a ball and socket joint to allow movement, up and down movement of the wheel and so on. Okay, and then at the end of the steering rack, at the end of the tie rod, the inner tie rod, we have these threads here. And we all know this now. This is where the outer tie rod fastens to the steering rack. It is threaded on. And you can see we marked the inner fender 17, and on the other side I put a 16. That is how many threads the outer tie rod took to remove itself from the inner. So we want to make sure we get that as close as possible, that outer tie rod, onto the inner, because that will affect the direction of the wheels. If we don't thread the outer tie rod on, if we don't thread it on enough, then the outer tie rod's going to be out here, which is going to cause our wheel to turn either left or right, and then as we're driving down the road, we're going to wear our tires out and the vehicle will be unstable. So in this Santa Fe, the steering rack sat up in here, okay, on top of the subframe. You can see our stabilizer bar runs across. So it was a bit of a job to get it out because we had to remove that engine mount right there, and that supports the drivetrain. And then if we look up here, we can see our two fluid lines. So one of these lines, you can see the end of it right there. Okay, you can see the flare on the line, and then there's a rubber seal right there. So one of these two lines is our pressure line, and the other one is the return line. And if we were to follow those lines, we would see they go up there, and then they go all the way up to the steering pump somewhere up in there. And right here, we have our steering shaft, our input shaft, and that comes from the steering wheel. And you can see how it's got a joint because the angle changes from where it comes out of the firewall to where it fastens to the input shaft of the rack. And you can see the splines inside here. Okay, and that's so it can fasten down on top of the input shaft of the rack. And then we have our through bolt here, which pinches this is what we call the intermediate steering shaft. Okay, and then the through bolt goes through here, and it just locks the intermediate steering shaft onto the input shaft of the steering rack. So back to the rack for a second. This is a dust boot. You can see there's a dust boot at either end, and the dust boot just protects. Inside here is a seal that keeps the fluid inside the steering rack. There's a seal, the end seal here, and then there's an end seal there under that boot there. And it's very common for these seals to leak, and what happens is they leak and they fill these dust boots. So if the customer complains of a steering issue, of whining steering, or we notice that the fluid is low in the reservoir and we don't see a leak anywhere, so what we might do sometimes is just poke a hole, a little tiny hole in this dust boot, and if fluid drips out, that means that this end seal is leaking. So that wasn't the case on this one. The fluid leak was actually coming from the input shaft seal underneath this column. Okay, so if I do that, maybe we'll see some oil. It was running down here onto his driveway. So this is the mount right here. These two bolt holes right here is what fastens the rack to the subframe, and then we have two more on the other end. So this one you can see is rusty. We had to remove this from the old rack. You can see the mark here where it's sat. We removed it from here and put it on there, and now the steering rack is ready to go back in. Yeah. Okay, so the rack going in was easier than it was to come out. You can see, so we put it in. We put it in through the driver's side because we have the collar here, the input shaft where the valve is. So we have to put it in this way. There's no way we'd be able to feed this all the way through from the passenger side to the driver's side. We also had to undo the stabilizer bar because the bar sits like this, and you can see how the bar wraps right over the steering rack like that. So we had to undo both links and then push the bar up like that so we had more room. We also received these two rubber seals that came with the rack, and we are going to replace the seals on the pressure and the return line. Okay, we're going to put new seals in there before we thread the lines into the rack, and you can see the two holes right there on the steering rack where the lines go. Okay, and then you can see how our input shaft is almost lined up with the steering rack pinion gear. Okay, so we have to, what we do is we pull the shaft down like that, and then we would line it up on top of the input shaft like that and try to slide it down. It's a bit of work. Okay, and then the two bolt holes, one there and one over there, that hold the rack down onto the subframe, and the other two are right down there like that. So you can see it's a bit of work, it's tight. And then of course the engine mount that we removed sits right over the rack here, and it bolts 1, 2, and 3 bolts to the transmission, and then underneath 3 bolt holes right here, 1, 2, and 3, and those bolts go up and they fasten the mount to the subframe and to the transmission, and that's the transmission mount there. So we're going to finish putting this sucker back together, and hopefully it goes good. So if we look at these 3 seals right here, these rubber seals, that is the old one. Point to the old one, Frank.
There's the old one.
That's the old one. And if you look at it, you can see it's worn out and it definitely needs replacing. So if I flip it over, you can see, hopefully, that it's in rough shape. But the seals they sent are too big. So they sent us the wrong seals. You have to make sure when you guys replace that, you look at this stuff. You put the wrong seal where the pressure line is, it's going to shoot out of there and it's going to leak and piss you off. So we went to our seals, all our different seals right here, our seal kit, and we found 2 that are the right size. So not only do we have to worry about the ID, which is the inner diameter of the seal, but also the OD, which is the outer diameter of the seal, ID and OD. So we found 2 good seals there. The 2 they sent can go in the garbage. 16.
What's 16?
16 turns.
16 you had there.
1. Let's try that again. 13, 14, 15, 16. So 16 turns, just like it says right there. So now the jam nut here, we'll lock down onto the outer tie rod. The outer tie rod's going to go into the knuckle right here. And that way we know that it's pretty close to where it was. We're still going to send it for an alignment. But that way we know it's pretty close to where it was when we removed them. So I tighten the outer tie rod to the steering knuckle. That's called a castellated nut. It looks like sort of like a castle. And there is a hole through the outer tie rod, the stud right here of the outer tie rod. And what we do is we line up one of these slots of the nut with the hole, and we put a cotter pin through it. And you can just sort of see the hole there. So I have to line up the nut with the hole so I can slide a cotter pin through, and the cotter pin will just prevent the nut from coming free and loose. So we got everything back together underneath. Now we have to fill up the steering reservoir and bleed all the air out of the steering system, because now we got air in there. So I'll show you how to do that. So there's the reservoir. This line looks like it goes to maybe a steering cooler to keep the fluid cool. Probably goes to the front, in front of the rad somewhere. This is our return line from the pump. So there's the pump. You can see it's driven by the serpentine belt. Okay, there's the pulley of the power steering pump, and then all the other pulleys that the belt drives, that's driven by the crankshaft way down there. And this is the pressure line that goes to the steering rack. And then the return from the steering rack. And the return from the steering rack is down there, and it goes to the steering cooler. All right, and then from the steering cooler back, and then from the reservoir to the pump, and then the pressure line to the steering rack. So we have to fill up the reservoir, and I'll show you what we're going to do. So I've filled up the reservoir to the low line, and then what we're going to do is, with the engine off, we're going to turn the steering wheel all the way from one end to the other. And what that's going to do is that's going to draw the fluid through the steering rack and through all the lines and through the valves and so on, and in return it's going to push all the fluid and any of the air that's in the system back up here into the reservoir, where then it will diminish, and then the level will fall as the system fills with fluid, and then we'll have to top it up. So we'll do that back and forth all the way from one end to the other, maybe 10, 15, 20 times, and then we'll check